Good morning. It's Friday, January 25th, 2019. This is Up Front. I'm Janine Etter. On today's show, there's a growing movement speaking out against the widespread practice of non-religious circumcisions routinely performed on infant males. They call themselves intactivists. We speak with Georganne Chapin, Executive Director of Intact America, about their position on infant male circumcision. The Intact movement views the common non-religious medical procedure of circumcision on male babies in the U.S. as a human rights violation. They see the procedure as having long-term negative effects on males, both physically and psychologically. They believe all infants should remain intact. They call themselves intactivists. For more, we're joined by Georganne Chapin, Executive Director of Intact America. And as a word of caution to listeners, this segment has minor descriptive language of male genitalia and may contain some uncomfortable language around circumcision and its historical root causes. Although it is in alignment with FCC regulations, listener discretion is advised. So, Georganne Chapin, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me on your program, Janine.
So talk about the Intact movement. What is it, and what are you all seeking to do?
Well, Intact America is part of a larger movement. We refer to ourselves as intactivists, or the intactivist movement. It's obviously a coined word, but one that has certainly taken hold. And the goal of intactivism is to give boys the same rights as girls, and allow them to go through life with their genitals intact and protect them from unnecessary traumatic genital surgery that they can't consent to. Our way of achieving that is to change the way Americans think about circumcision, because the United States is unique among all developed countries in its medicalization of babies' genitals and its compulsion to cut off the infant foreskin. We want people to think of intact, of normal male genitalia as indeed normal, and to assume that boys should be left the way nature or God made them, that you don't need to be subjected to surgery a few hours after being born just because you're a boy. We also are part of a larger human rights framework, of course, where we believe in individual autonomy. We believe in equality of all people, male, female, and intersex. And we believe in kindness and in starting life in a peaceful way. We believe that will make people happier and make their families and partners happier later in life.
And this is largely a parental argument, isn't it? So when a baby is born in a hospital, it is the parent's decision as to whether or not their child is circumcised.
Yes, the parents are asked, although they weren't always, when circumcision became rampant in United States hospitals, parents were not even necessarily asked. They were told that, okay, it's time to circumcise your little boy. But yes, they're asked to sign a consent form. Of course, it's a strange thing because parents are not allowed to consent to just anything that somebody can do to their child. You cannot sign a consent form that allows your daughter, that allows somebody else to have sex with your underage daughter, for example, or your underage son. You can't consent to have somebody beat up your child. So it's a strange, circumcision is a very strange phenomenon in that parental consent is deemed to be valid. Of course, we believe that nobody but the person who's going to bear the consequences of the intervention, nobody but that person should be able to consent. Now, clearly, we're not talking about necessary medical treatment. Parents can consent to medical treatment that's necessary to save the life or the health of a child. But in infant male circumcision, we're talking about cutting off a totally normal, functional body part that will be a painful and traumatic experience for the infant and will have lifelong consequences, sexually and sometimes psychologically.
And are you aware of any long-term psychological impacts?
There's a tremendous amount of material out more and more now. Part of it is due to the growing acceptability of having this conversation that the Intactivist movement is having. Intact America has been, we were founded about 10 years ago. We are part of a much larger movement. And we've all heard over the years accounts, increasing numbers of accounts from men who are extremely upset at having had their autonomy and their bodies violated, people who have terrible complications from their infant circumcisions and they're living with them for a lifetime. A lot of men who didn't realize that some of the sexual problems, men and women didn't realize some of the sexual problems that they are having are due to poorly performed circumcisions or complications. And yeah, psychological trauma, anger, rage. Obviously not every man, not everybody who's been circumcised, just as you'll find many women from African countries and Arab countries that cut girls' genitalia to varying degrees. You'll find women who will say that, they're not upset at having been circumcised. One of the main reasons that men report being very upset is that they were not asked. Someone took a body part from them without asking them. And I often will say to people who say, well, it wasn't an important body part. It's like, well, yeah, it was yours, though. The infant foreskin is a little tiny structure, just like a baby's heart is a tiny structure, or a baby's fingers are tiny. But the male foreskin in an adult man amounts to about 15 square inches of nerve-laden, blood vessel-laden, muscle-bound or erogenous tissue. It's extremely sensitive. 15 square inches is, the size of a 3x5 index card. It's a double layer of skin. It's unique in that its sensitivity is not like the skin in any other part of the body. And once men start to realize that, a lot of times they're not really totally aware of what the foreskin even is. And once they start to think about it and realize it and talk to other people and see pictures and think about what was done to them, it's one reason this conversation is so difficult to have, because for somebody to find out that this was done to them and agreed to by people who love them and were supposed to protect them, it creates all kinds of problems.
I saw on the Intact Bay Area website that the founder of that site, his name was Jonathan Conte. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he committed suicide in 2016, and although he didn't leave a note, the website said that apparently the pain and rage over his own mutilation finally overwhelmed him. Is that what you would attribute his suicide to?
With Jonathan, yes.
And this is rage and grief of men who've been circumcised that's not being talked about.
Well, it's being talked about more and more thanks to groups like Intact America, and thanks to the documentary American Circumcision, thanks to the mainstream media and people like you, Janine, being willing to talk about this in public.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the circumcision debate, the religious reasons for circumcision. Christian, Jewish, Islamic. What about that argument?
Well, there are about 1.2 million circumcisions performed in the United States each year, and not more than a few thousand are religious rituals. They're all done in American hospitals by doctors or nurses or medical students. So that's really, it's frankly, in terms of the American circumcision problem, it's really a red herring. The truth is, as far as ritual circumcisions, and let me just say, without getting into, I'm not an expert on Islam. I'm not an expert on Judaism. I am an expert on bioethics. That religious rituals change over time, and all kinds of, Catholics stopped, giving the Mass in Latin, and they stopped their prohibition on eating meat on Fridays. I mean, religious rituals change over time, and there's no exception to that. And also in the United States, religious freedom is recognized, but there are legal cases that say that your religious freedom ends when it harms another person. We believe that cutting a baby's genitals is an example of that. So I don't spend a lot of time debating the religious arguments for circumcision, because 99 and then some % of the circumcisions conducted in the United States have nothing to do with religion. They have to do with the fact that a circumcised penis was normalized by doctors and became something that hospitals could carry out as part of a larger suite of interventions sold to or foisted upon childbearing women. And it's a fee-for-service procedure that's done in hospitals and billed for by doctors, and parents are literally sold a bill of goods when they're told that they should allow their precious newborn to be taken away to a surgical room, strapped down, often as part of an assembly line of screaming babies, and swabbed and naked in a cold room when he's a few hours old, and having somebody slice off part of his penis. It's a barbarity, and it's got nothing to do with religious freedom.
And what about the benefit? Protection against HIV, urinary tract infections, penile cancer?
Well, you could cut off any body part and you could prevent cancer, right? So you could cut off girls' breasts. You could take out your appendix, it would never get infected. You could pull all your teeth and never get dental caries. So, you're not going to get an infection of your foreskin if you remove your foreskin. You're not going to get an ingrown toenail if you remove your toenails. We don't remove body parts. Routinely remove healthy, normal, functional body parts. In this case, a body part that provides protection of the penis and gives great pleasure to the man and to his sexual partners. We don't remove body parts because they might cause a problem down the line. The urinary tract infection argument is really spurious, even though it's possible that that intact boys possibly get more urinary tract infections than circumcised boys. We believe a couple things. One is that often that's because parents are taught to fool with the penis, to pull the foreskin back and wash it and scrub it, and can create micro tears, and the intact penis should just be left alone. The other is that boys get fewer urinary tract infections in general than girls do, and we treat girls with cheap and effective antibiotics for UTIs. You don't go cutting body parts off to prevent that. As far as the HIV argument, American cemeteries are full of circumcised men who died from AIDS. The epidemic started here at a time when probably 80 to 90% of adult men in this country were circumcised. You don't prevent HIV by... Also, the HIV arguments in Africa, which I believe are extremely problematic, say that men are protected from getting HIV from women if they're circumcised. Bottom line is, if a man doesn't wear a condom because he thinks he's protected and he is HIV positive, he will infect his female partner. Condoms are the only effective... Condoms or abstinence are the only effective ways of preventing HIV. The African studies upon which this myth is based were very poor methodologically, and basically they've been cited as a way of selling circumcision to the third world.
And why do you think people aren't as concerned about male circumcision as they are about female circumcision in this country? Because
male circumcision has been so normalized and people have bought the myth. The truth is that in this country, girls were also subjected to genital surgery into the 1970s. clitoridectomy was performed on little girls who masturbated too much, never became as ubiquitous as male circumcision, thank God. But it's just something that, has become part of American culture. Doctors have stopped doing a lot of things that they used to do to people, and they need to stop doing this.
And how does the Intact movement align at all with movements like the Me Too movement against sexual assault or women's rights, if at all?
Well, I think that the principles of the Intactivist movement line right up with that. I mean, we believe that nobody has a right to assault you, nobody has a right to interfere with your bodily autonomy. Only you can consent to that. So our principles are extremely consistent with that. They're also totally consistent with the principles that nobody has the right to cut the genitals of little girls. Because circumcision is so ubiquitous and so defended in the U.S., unfortunately, those movements don't necessarily embrace our cause. I believe personally that that equality is equality, and if you want girls to be safe, that will never happen as long as boys are being routinely cut. The fact that we don't care about boys' rights does not bolster women's rights. It actually threatens women's rights, and it also sets people against each other. The arguments when people tell you how different female genital mutilation is than male genital mutilation, the arguments are circular and just wrong. Sometimes people discuss motive. Well, female genital cutting is done to inhibit a girl or a woman's sexual desire. Well, American circumcision has its roots in the same place. American circumcision started during Victorian times by doctors to keep boys from masturbating, because it was in the Freudian times, and it was recognized that boys use their foreskin for the mobility of the penis and for pleasure. So cutting the foreskin off was seen as a way of keeping boys from masturbating. Go back 800 years before that, or 700 years before that, and the philosopher and physician Maimonides, a Jewish philosopher and physician, said that women liked men better who weren't circumcised, and that's the reason to circumcise boys, is so that everybody would stick to their knitting. Boys would stick to their studies and girls wouldn't desire them. It was also recognized as being, the foreskin was recognized as being part of sexual pleasure, and cutting it off was seen as a way to blunt sexual pleasure. So it's unfortunate that we can't see that all children need to be protected from genital assault. Male children, female children, and intersex children who might be born with genitals that don't look like what society thinks their genitals should look like, but are in fact at no risk, suffer no medical consequences, and also increasingly are speaking out. People who've had intersex people who were operated on when they were tiny children, and nobody knew what they were going to want or what their desires were going to be or how they were going to identify sexually in terms of gender or sexuality, are saying, why couldn't I have been left alone? All we're asking for is that people be left alone. We're not asking for anything particular to be done.
And Lloyd Schofield, the man behind the ballot measure, he wanted to lead the charge in having a circumcision ban in San Francisco. And that was struck down basically because it didn't have a religious exemption in the language.
It was struck down because the rationale given by the court was that medical practice was regulated by states, and therefore San Francisco had no right to regulate it. Now, a similar, very interesting case was just ruled on in Michigan. It was a case against a Muslim female physician who performed some type of genital intervention, cutting on several little Muslim girls who were brought by their moms from Minnesota to Michigan for the procedure. And she was prosecuted in federal court in Michigan, and the court decided in the favor of the physician because they found the federal prohibition against female genital cutting was unconstitutional. Now, interestingly, I also believe it's unconstitutional. I believe it's unconstitutional because it discriminates against boys. But the unconstitutional argument that was given by the federal court was that the kind of behavior that was being prosecuted there was regulated by states, that there was no federal right to regulate that behavior. So this is all very much in flux, and states are trying to implement laws against female genital cutting, and I think that those efforts are an opportunity for people like me and our organization, Intact America, and other intactivist organizations to weigh in and call for equality.
So what's next, legislatively speaking, for...
I don't know. Intact America, we really don't focus our efforts on trying to ban male circumcision. I believe that I'm an attorney in addition to a public health specialist, and I believe that legislation follows public attitudes. It follows social change. It doesn't create social change. So if you look at a very recent example of that, same-sex marriage, you weren't going to see legislation permitting same-sex marriage until the country was pretty much either on board or didn't care, right? So there are a lot of people who just maybe cared and don't care anymore whether gay people have the right to get married or not. And then there are a lot of people who believe very fervently and correctly that people should be allowed to marry whoever they want. So what we are aiming for at Intact America, we are measuring changes in beliefs and attitudes. So we believe that once we get to a critical point, a tipping point and all social change literature shows that's around somewhere between 20 and 25% of the American public believes that the normal thing to do is to leave a newborn boy alone, that his genitals are just fine, and that the intact male body is just fine. As soon as people come to embrace that belief, we believe that the circumcision rate will fall precipitously.
And is there anything else you'd like to add?
Intact America is a part of a nonprofit organization based in Tarrytown, New York. We have 2 Facebook pages. We have Intact America group on Facebook, and we also have the circumcision debate on Facebook. Between those 2 sites, we have around 55,000 followers. We have a mailing list of nearly 40,000 people. If you'd like to get on our mailing list, you can write to us, info@intactamerica.org. And then we have our 2 websites, circumcisiondebate.org and intactamerica.org. We also happy to be able to say that there's now this mainstream documentary called American Circumcision, which is, as you had said earlier, a little difficult to watch, but highly rewarding, I think, for people who have curiosity about this topic. And talk about this among your family and friends. This should not be a taboo topic. If we're performing unconsented to surgery on 3,500 boys every single day in this country, we shouldn't be silent about it. We ought to be having this very important discussion. So don't be shy, show the film to your family and friends and have a discussion about it. And I predict the more people are exposed to the conversation, the better off we'll all be.
Well, Georganne Chapin, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Janine.
That was Georganne Chapin, Executive Director of Intact America, speaking about the growing movement against the widespread practice of non-religious male circumcision in America and the need to keep babies intact. That does it for today's show. Upfront airs weekday mornings at 7 a.m. We post information about our topics and our guests online at kpfa.org, where you can also dig through our archives, subscribe to the show as a podcast, and connect to us on social media. If you'd like to give us feedback on something you heard or suggest something for us to cover, send an email to upfront@kpfa.org. A big thanks to everyone who makes the show happen. Producer is Corinne Smith, engineer is Rada Kiel, intern is Justin Gold, hosts are Brian Edwards-Teekert, Kat Brooks, and me, Janine Etter, on Fridays. Also, special thanks to Mitch Jeserich and Eileen Alfandary. A big shout out to the brothers and sisters on the other side of the wall who are listening to our program. Stay tuned to listener-sponsored radio 94.1 KPFA.